air inside the concert hall was heavy, filled with the kind of silence that feels more like pressure than peace. It was a big night, the kind of night that young musicians dream about and judges dread. The venue was massive, with high ceilings that seemed to swallow the light and plush red seats that stretched back far into the darkness. At the front, a large, shiny black piano sat waiting, looking less like an instrument and more like a sleeping beast waiting to be woken up. But for the moment, the beast was quiet. The people who held the power in this room, the judges, were seated at a long table, just a few feet away from the stage. They were important people in the world of music. They were critics, teachers, and famous performers from America, and they had seen it all, or at least they thought they had. Backstage, in the cramped and dimly lit hallway, a young boy stood waiting. He was Japanese, very small for his age, and he looked incredibly out of place. He was wearing a simple black suit that was a little too big for him, hanging loosely off his thin shoulders. His hair was neat and combed, and his shoes were polished. But next to the other contestants, he looked like a child playing dress-up. The others were older, taller, and carried themselves with a confidence that comes from years of training in the best schools in Europe and America. They walked with their heads high, talking loudly about composers and techniques. The boy, however, stood perfectly still. He held his hands behind his back, looking down at the floor. He didn't look nervous, exactly, but he didn't look confident either. He looked like he was in a trance. Focusing on something that nobody else could see, the man in charge of the show stuck his head into the hallway. He looked at a clipboard, then down at the small boy, and finally called out a name that was difficult for him to pronounce. The boy looked up, nodded once, and walked toward the heavy velvet curtain. As he moved past the other contestants, a few of them glanced at him. There was no meanness in their looks, just pity. They knew what was waiting for him on the other side of that curtain. They had heard the whispers. They knew how the American judges reacted to outsiders, especially ones who were so young and so quiet. The boy stepped through the curtain and out onto the stage. The sudden brightness of the spotlight hit him, blinding him for a second. He had to squint to see the edge of the stage. As he walked toward the piano, his footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet. He looked tiny under the massive lights of the theater. To the judges, he looked like a gust of wind could blow him right over. He wasn't the image of a powerful virtuoso. He looked fragile. When the audience saw him, a polite ripple of applause moved through the room. It was the kind of applause people give when they want to be nice, but they don't expect much. It was quiet, respectful, but lacking energy. The boy reached the piano. He adjusted the bench, lifting it up slightly because his legs were short. He sat down, straightened his jacket, and placed his hands on his knees. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a waiting silence. The judges sat back in their chairs. One of them, a man with gray hair and a very stern face, looked at his watch. Another, a woman with sharp glasses, tapped her pen against her clipboard. They were tired. It had been a long night of listening to okay performances and bad performances. They were ready to go home. They looked at this small boy from Japan, and they didn't see a prodigy. They saw a novelty act. They saw a cute kid who probably knew how to play a simple song well enough to make his parents proud. Then, the murmuring started. It began near the front. One of the judges leaned over to the woman next to him and whispered something behind his hand. He didn't say it loudly, but in the quiet hall, the sound carried. It was a chuckle, a low, dismissive laugh. He was making a joke about the boy's size, or perhaps about the idea that someone so small could fill the room with sound. The woman next to him smiled, a tight, knowing smile. She whispered back. A few other people in the audience, close enough to hear, or just assuming the same thing, began to shift in their seats. The atmosphere became thick with skepticism. It wasn't open hostility. It was a cold wall of doubt. The boy sat there, staring at the keys. The black and white ivory reflected the stage lights back at him. He didn't look at the judges. He didn't look at the hundreds of people watching him. He just breathed. In and out. Slow and steady. He knew they were laughing. He could feel the judgment rolling over the stage like a cold wave. He knew what they were thinking. They thought he was a joke. They thought he was wasting their time. He had seen that look before in other cities, in other halls. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't look angry or sad. He just sat there, perfectly calm. Like the surface of a lake on a windless day, to the American judges, this stillness looked like fear. They thought he was frozen. They imagined that under the hot lights and the heavy gaze of the crowd, he had forgotten what he was supposed to do. The chuckles from the judges' table got a little louder. One man cleared his throat loudly, a signal that said, "Hurry up, we don't have all day." The tension in the room was uncomfortable now. It was awkward. Everyone just wanted the poor kid to play something so he could walk off stage. They could all move on. But the boy wasn't frozen in fear. He was gathering himself. He was connecting his mind to his hands and his heart to the music. To him, the laughter, the whispers, the tapping pens, and the heavy silence were just background noise. They were distractions, nothing more. He knew something they didn't. He knew that the moment he decided to play, the world would change. He didn't need to be big to be powerful. He didn't need to be loud to be heard. He just needed to be ready. He lifted his hands slowly from his knees. He hovered them over the keys, his fingers long and thin, poised like a hawk about to dive. The judges stopped whispering for a second, watching his hands. They were waiting to see if he would shake. They were waiting for a sign of weakness. The woman with the glasses raised her pen. Ready to write a low score the moment he hit a wrong note, the boy took one last deep breath. The air in the hall seemed to stop moving. The dust motes dancing in the spotlight froze. The skepticism hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was the perfect setup for a disaster, or the perfect setup for a miracle. The boy closed his eyes for just a split second, blocking out the lights, the judges, and the laughter. He found the silence inside himself, the silence where the music lived. And then he brought his hands down. The sound hadn't even started yet, but the energy in the room shifted instantly. The movement of his hands was so precise, so confident, that for a heartbeat, nobody laughed. The judges watched, their pens hovering. The audience leaned forward. The skepticism was still there, hovering like a cloud, but it was suddenly laced with a tiny spark of curiosity. They were about to find out that this wasn't a child playing a game. This was a master about to go to work. And as his fingers touched the cold ivory keys, the boy didn't just play a note. He began a story that would leave every single person in that room breathless. The very first sound that rang out from the piano didn't just break the silence. It shattered it. It wasn't a soft, tentative note like everyone expected. It was sharp, clear, and incredibly strong. It was like a crack of thunder on a sunny day. For a split second, the judges froze. The man who had been tapping his pen stopped midair. The woman with the glasses stopped writing and looked up, her eyes wide. The chuckles that had been rippling through the front row died instantly. It wasn't that the music was loud just for the sake of being loud. It was the quality of the sound. It was pure. It was perfect. And it was coming from a boy who looked like he could barely lift a heavy book, let alone command a massive concert grand piano. But the real shock wasn't just the sound. It was the speed. As the boy's hands started to move across the keyboard, a blur of motion took over. His fingers were flying so fast that they were almost invisible. The audience, who had been ready to politely endure a simple nursery rhyme or a slow, boring piece, found themselves leaning forward in their seats. They were blinking, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. This wasn't the polite, careful playing of a student. This was a whirlwind. Then came the second wave of disbelief. As the complexity of the music grew, the judges realized that this small boy wasn't playing a standard competition piece. He was tackling a monster of a song apiece that even the most experienced professionals fear to play because of its difficulty. The notes were cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall of diamonds. It required a strength in the fingers that most people don't have. Yet this child was making it look easy. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't gritting his teeth or tensing his shoulders. He looked like he was breathing. The piano seemed to be an extension of his arms. However, the human mind is a strange thing. When people see something that contradicts what they believe, their first reaction is often denial, not acceptance. Even though the music filling the hall was undeniably brilliant, A heavy layer of skepticism still hung over the room. The judges looked at each other, confused. They couldn't reconcile the small boy in the oversized suit with the masterful sounds hitting their ears. One of the judges, an older man with a stern face who had seen thousands of players over his career, leaned toward his neighbor. The noise of the piano was swelling, filling every corner of the vast hall, so he had to shout to be heard. He cupped his hand over his mouth and said something that made the woman next to him frown. He pointed at the stage, shaking his head. He was convinced it was a trick. He thought perhaps the boy was a one-trick pony, someone who had memorized a single, flashy piece to show off speed, but had no real soul or emotion. He thought it was just mechanical noise, like a robot programmed to hit keys as fast as possible. This sentiment started to spread. It wasn't spoken loudly, but it was felt. A few people in the audience sat back, crossing their arms. They admitted he was fast, sure. They admitted he had technique, but they were waiting for the emotion. They were waiting for the music to breathe. They expected him to falter, to run out of steam, or to mess up the difficult parts. They thought, okay, kid, you can play fast. But can you make us feel anything? Or are you just a human metronome? The pressure on the stage was immense, but the boy didn't show any sign of cracking. He played on, his face calm and serene, his eyes focused on his hands. He was in a world of his own. The music was getting faster and more intricate. It was a technical maze that would have caused most players to trip up, to hit a wrong note, or to panic. But he never missed a beat. His accuracy was terrifyingly good. Every note was distinct, every rhythm perfect, yet the doubt in the room was like a thick fog. The judges were still critical. They were looking for flaws. They were scrutinizing his posture, his pedaling, his phrasing, searching desperately for something to critique so they could justify their initial dismissal of him. They wanted to be right. They wanted to believe that their years of experience meant they couldn't be fooled by a child. It is a hard thing for proud people to admit that they were wrong, that they had misjudged someone completely. As the piece moved into a quieter, more delicate section, the whispers started again. This was the moment the critics thought where the illusion would break. Soft playing is often harder than loud playing because it requires immense control. If he was just relying on speed, he would mess this up. He would play too softly, or the tone would become weak and thin. The judge with the stern face leaned forward, a smirk playing on his lips. He was waiting for the mistake. He was ready to pounce on it, but the boy's touch changed instantly. The heavy thunder of the previous moments vanished, replaced by a sound so gentle it felt like a whisper directly into the ear of everyone listening. He played the quiet notes with a sweetness that made the hall feel intimate, despite its size. The tone was singing warm and rich. It was the sound of a storyteller, not a technician. Still, the room was divided. Half the people were beginning to realize something special was happening. They could feel the hair on their arms standing up. The magic was starting to work on them. But the other half, the judges and the skeptics, were still holding on to their doubt. They thought it was a fluke. They thought he just got lucky with that quiet part. Then the music shifted again. The boy launched into a passage that was purely chaotic on paper. It was a storm of notes jumping all over the keyboard, requiring the hands to cross over each other constantly, stretching and reaching in impossible ways. It was the kind of music that looks terrifying to watch. The boy's left hand was racing over the right. His arms were flying. His body was swaying slightly to the rhythm. It was at this exact moment that the atmosphere began to crack. The sheer physical impossibility of what he was doing was starting to break through the wall of skepticism. The woman with the glasses stopped looking at her clipboard entirely. She just stared at his hands. Her mouth opened slightly. She was a pianist herself, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that what this boy was doing was extraordinarily difficult. She knew that even on her best day, she might struggle to play it half as cleanly. The whispers from the judges stopped completely. The man who had called it a trick sat back in his chair, his arms falling heavily to his sides. The smirk was gone. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't even thinking about being critical. He was just trying to process the reality in front of him. The boy was playing circles around them. He was doing things with the piano that they had only seen from the legends of the music world. The audience was dead silent now. There was no shifting in seats, no coughing, no whispering. The only sound in the entire hall was the music. It was a living, breathing thing that filled the space. The boy wasn't just playing notes. He was painting a picture with sound. He was taking them on a journey, and they were powerless to stop it. The doubt was still there, lingering in the back of the minds of a few stubborn souls, but it was fighting a losing battle. The truth was undeniable now. The boy wasn't a novelty act. He wasn't a cute kid with a trick. He was a force of nature. He hit a series of chords that were so powerful, they vibrated through the floorboards. You could feel the music in your chest. It was aggressive and angry, then suddenly tender and sad. The range of emotions he was pulling out of the instrument was vast. The judges looked at each other again, but this time, their expressions were different. They weren't exchanging looks of dismissal. They were exchanging looks of fear and wonder. They were realizing that they were witnessing history in the making. They were the ones who were supposed to be judging him, but now, they were the ones being judged. They were being judged by their own inability to see the greatness standing right in front of them, till it was too late to look away. The boy continued to play, unaware or uncaring of the epiphany happening in the judge's booth. He was just doing what he was born to do. And the harder he played, the more the walls of skepticism came tumbling down. The moment his fingers launched into the most difficult section of the piece, the atmosphere in the hall underwent a violent and sudden change. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside the boy. Up until now, the judges had been trying to find a label for him: a technician, a copycat, a kid with fast hands. But as the music sped up to a blur, those labels began to disintegrate. The complexity of the notes was staggering. It wasn't just that he was playing fast. It was that every single note had a purpose. Every sound carried weight, every pause carried meaning. The music was no longer just a collection of sounds. It was a living, breathing entity that was taking control of the room. The boy's hands were moving so fast that they looked like they were vibrating. On the piano, there are white keys and black keys, and hitting them accurately at high speeds is a nightmare for even the best players. One wrong move, one finger slipping by a fraction of an inch, and the magic breaks. The spell shatters. But this boy didn't miss, not once. He was navigating a minefield of notes with a fearlessness that was terrifying to watch. He jumped from the low end of the keyboard to the high end with such precision that it felt calculated, like a math equation that was solving itself in real dash time. The silence in the audience was absolute. But it was a tense silence. It was the kind of quiet you feel when watching a tightrope walker stepping out over a deep canyon. Everyone was holding their breath. They were waiting for the mistake. Human beings are conditioned to expect failure when the stakes are this high. It seemed impossible that a small child could maintain this level of intensity without cracking under the pressure. Surely his fingers would get tired. Surely his mind would lose focus for a split second. But minute after minute, he kept going. He was like a machine that was fueled by pure passion. The physical effort was visible now. A small vein bulged in his temple as he attacked the keys. His body swayed. Not because he was trying to look dramatic, but because the music was moving through him. He was surrendering to the instrument. He wasn't telling the piano what to do. He was letting the piano speak through him. This is something that only the greatest musicians in history ever achieve. Most people spend their entire lives learning how to control the instrument. This boy had skipped the control part and gone straight to becoming one with it. The judges were now in a state of shock. The man with the stern face had completely abandoned his critical posture. His pen was nowhere to be found. He was sitting on the edge of his chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together under his chin. His eyes were darting back and forth between the boy's hands and his face, trying to figure out where this power was coming from. He had played this piece himself. He knew exactly how hard it was. He knew the sections where the hands collide, where the rhythm tries to trip you up. He knew the impossible spots. And watching this boy glide through those spots as if they were nothing was making him question everything he thought he knew about music. The woman with the sharp glasses had taken her glasses off. She didn't need them to see the truth anymore. She was rubbing her eyes, perhaps wondering if she was dreaming. The skepticism that had clouded her vision earlier was gone, replaced by a look of pure humility. She realized that she had judged a book by its cover, and now she was reading the most beautiful poetry she had ever encountered. The feeling in her chest wasn't just admiration. It was a little bit of shame. She felt bad for the thoughts she had had just 10 minutes ago. She felt bad for the laughter she had shared. The music was acting like a mirror, forcing her to see her own arrogance. In the audience, people were forgetting to blink. A young man in the back row, who had come to the concert only because he was dragged there by his girlfriend, found himself with his mouth open. He didn't know anything about classical music. He didn't know the composer or the difficulty of the piece. But he didn't need to. The emotion was universal. The boy was playing with a raw intensity that transcended language. It sounded like a battle, then a conversation, then a cry for help, and finally a shout of joy. It was a story without words, and everyone understood it. The sound filled the huge hall, bouncing off the high ceilings and the velvet walls. It was rich and full. The quiet moments were so delicate that you could hear a pin drop, and the loud moments were thunderous, shaking the floorboards. The boy was using the entire dynamic range of the piano, painting with every color available to him. He was sweating now. A small drop of perspiration rolled down his forehead, but he didn't wipe it away. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The music had taken over, and he was just the vessel. Then, the piece moved into its final, most aggressive phase. The notes were cascading like a waterfall. It was a flurry of sound that seemed almost chaotic in its complexity. Yet underneath there was a structure, a rock-solid foundation of rhythm that held it all together. The boy's hands were a blur of motion, crossing over each other, stretching far apart, then coming back together in a tight embrace. He was pushing the piano to its absolute limit. The strings inside the instrument were vibrating violently, creating a resonance that you could feel in your bones. The judges were now completely mesmerized. They weren't thinking about scores. They weren't thinking about the other contestants. They weren't thinking about dinner or their schedules. All they could think about was the boy who walked onto the stage looking so small, the boy they laughed at, the boy they dismissed. Now, he seemed like a giant. He had filled the room with his presence. He had commanded their respect without saying a single word. It was a masterclass in performance. It was a lesson delivered not by a teacher, but by a prodigy, who was too young to understand the concept of failure. The tension in the hall was reaching its breaking point. The music was racing toward a climax. The rhythm was speeding up, driving forward like a train rushing down a track. The boy's face was intense, focused, filled with a fierce joy. He was smiling, a tiny, barely there smile, but it was there. He knew he had them. He knew he had one. As the final chords approached, the boy lifted his hands high above his head. The room held its collective breath one last time. The silence was heavy, electric, waiting for the impact. It was the calm before the final storm. The boy brought his hands down with a force that seemed to come from the soles of his feet. The sound that exploded from the piano was deafening in the best possible way. It was a declaration. It was a statement. It was the sound of barriers breaking. The laughter, the doubt, the skepticism, it was all washed away in that singular, powerful moment. The boy didn't just play the piano. He conquered it. The final crash of sound seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the high ceilings of the concert hall long after the boy's fingers had left the keys. It wasn't just a noise. It was a physical force that rattled the chests of everyone in the room. For a heartbeat, the world stood completely still. The boy sat frozen on the bench, his hands hovering in the air just above the keys, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. His eyes were closed, as if he were savoring the last echoes of the music that had just poured out of him. He was absorbing the energy of the room, feeling the shift that had taken place. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The bright stage lights made him squint, but a small, humble smile touched his lips. He lowered his hands to his lap, straightened his jacket, and stood up. The movement was simple and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm of energy he had just unleashed. He walked to the center of the stage and bowed deeply. It was a bow of respect to the instrument, to the music, and to the audience. When he straightened up and began to walk off the stage, he didn't look at the judges. He didn't look for their approval. He didn't seek their applause. He just walked with the same calm, quiet demeanor he had when he walked on, as if he had just finished a practice session in an empty room. He stepped into the shadows of the wings, and the heavy velvet curtain swung shut behind him, hiding him from view, and then the dam broke. It started in the back of the hall. A single person clapped. Then 2, then 10. Within seconds, the polite silence that usually fills the space between a performance and the applause was completely obliterated. The sound wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. It was a mixture of shock, awe, and apology. The audience jumped to their feet. It wasn't the slow, polite standing ovation that people give out of obligation. It was an explosion. People were cheering. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. The man who had been dragged there by his girlfriend was shouting, "Bravo!" at the top of his lungs, not caring that he didn't know the protocol. But the most dramatic change was happening at the judges' table. The man with the stern face, the one who had chuckled and tapped his pen, was on his feet instantly. He wasn't just clapping. He was looking at the empty stage with an expression of total disbelief. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a look of humility. He realized he had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong. He had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside had turned out to be a masterpiece. He felt a profound respect for the small boy who had walked off the stage. The woman with the sharp glasses was clapping so hard her palms were stinging. She had a huge smile on her face, the kind of smile that comes from witnessing something truly rare. Her earlier cynicism had melted away. She wasn't thinking about the technical difficulties or the scorecard anymore. She was thinking about the feeling. The music had reached past her brain and grabbed her heart. She looked at her fellow judges, and they all shared the same look. It was a look that said, "Did we really just see that?" The applause continued for a long time. In the concert hall, the sound swirled around, bouncing off the walls, refusing to die down. The curtains twitched slightly as someone peeked out from backstage, but the boy didn't come back out. He had said what he needed to say. He didn't need to bask in the applause to validate his talent. The music was enough. As the cheering finally began to subside slightly, the atmosphere in the room felt different. The air felt lighter, cleansed. The tension and skepticism that had poisoned the room earlier were gone. In their place was a sense of wonder. People started talking to each other in excited whispers. They weren't discussing dinner plans or the weather anymore. They were trying to put into words what they had just felt. "How did he do that?" one person asked. "I've never heard anything like it," another replied. "His hands. They were magic." The judges sat back down, but they were restless. The energy of the performance was still coursing through them. They picked up their clipboards, but they looked at them with hesitation. How do you grade a miracle? How do you give a number to something that moved you so deeply? The woman with the glasses tapped her pen against the paper, then wrote something quickly. She didn't even look at the categories for technique or tone. She just wrote a single word at the top of the page and circled it 3 times. She had a feeling that tonight the competition was over. She didn't care who played next. In her mind, they were just playing for second place. Backstage, the boy was standing near a table with water bottles. He took a sip, his hands steady as a rock. An older woman, a backstage assistant, walked up to him. She looked like she wanted to hug him, but she held back, respecting his space. She had seen the faces of the judges when the boy walked off stage. She knew he had just changed the vibe of the entire competition. "They loved you," the woman whispered to him, her voice full of emotion. The boy looked at her, tilting his head slightly. He didn't look surprised. He just smiled that same shy smile and nodded. "I love the piano," he said softly. It was the only explanation he offered. He didn't talk about winning. He didn't talk about proving the judges wrong. He talked about the instrument. For him, it wasn't about beating the Americans or showing off. It was simply about letting the music out. The contrast between the atmosphere before the performance and now was heartbreaking. Just 20 minutes ago, this boy had been a target of laughter and pity. He had been invisible to them, a small obstacle in their evening. Now he was the only thing anyone could talk about. He had forced them to see him, not with words or arguments, but with beauty. He had shamed their prejudice with his talent. In the judges' room, the conversation was heated. They were supposed to discuss the next contestant, but nobody could focus. The man with the stern face was shaking his head. "I have been playing for 50 years, he said to the others, his voice low and serious. "And I have never seen that kind of connection with the instrument. Not in a child, and rarely in an adult." He admitted that he had been ready to write the boy off. "I am glad I was wrong," he added. "It reminds me why I love music. It always has the power to surprise you." The audience, too, was changed. As they filed out of the hall during the intermission, the buzz of conversation was electric. People were reevaluating their own biases. They realized they had underestimated the boy because of his size, his race, or his quiet nature. They felt a collective sense of gratitude that they had been there to witness it. It was one of those rare moments in life where you leave a room feeling different than when you entered it. The boy sat quietly on a chair in the dressing room, waiting for the next part of the show. He didn't know he had just become a legend in the minds of everyone present. He didn't know that the story of the Japanese prodigy who silenced the American judges would be told for years to come. He was just happy to have played. He sat with his hands folded, feeling the lingering tingle in his fingertips, ready for whatever came next. The doubters had been silenced, not by force, but by a truth so powerful it couldn't be ignored. After the intermission, the atmosphere in the concert hall was completely unrecognizable. It felt like a different building entirely. The air, which had previously been thick with skepticism and boredom, was now buzzing with a raw, electric energy. People weren't looking at their phones or whispering about their dinner plans. They were leaning forward, talking to their neighbors with wide eyes and flushed faces. Everyone was asking the same question. "Did you see that?" The memory of the small boy in the oversized suit was fresh in their minds, hanging over the room like a beautiful ghost. The judges, too, were a transformed group. The stern man who had laughed earlier was now sitting with his elbows on the table, staring intently at the empty stage. He looked like a man who had just seen a UFO. He wasn't checking his watch or tapping his pen. He was waiting. They were all waiting. The next few contestants walked onto the stage one by one, talented musicians. Students from prestigious academies, people who had practiced for years. But for the first time all night, the judges held them to a new standard. And tragically, against the memory of the prodigy, they all fell short. A young woman played a difficult piece perfectly. She hit every note. Her technique was clean, and her dress was beautiful. But when she finished, the applause was polite, even sympathetic. It wasn't her fault. She was a good pianist, but she wasn't a storyteller. She played the notes, but she didn't make them breathe. The audience had just witnessed a miracle. An ordinary excellence suddenly felt boring. The judges nodded at her respectfully, but you could see they were distracted. They were still hearing the thunder of the boy's finale in their heads. Backstage, the boy was sitting quietly while all this chaos swirled around him. He didn't act like a star. He wasn't bragging to the other contestants or demanding attention. In fact, he had gone back to his small corner, taken out a book, and started reading. He seemed to have turned off the performer switch the moment he walked off stage. For him, the hard work was done. He had expressed what was in his heart, and now he was at peace. A few minutes later, the competition official hurried over to him. The woman looked breathless and excited. She knelt down beside his chair so she could speak to him. "Ito, the judges want to see you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "In the green room? Right now." The boy marked his page, closed his book, and stood up. He wasn't nervous. He just thought maybe he had broken a rule or parked his bag in the wrong place. He walked down the long hallway to the green room, his small footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. When he opened the door, he saw the 3 judges standing there. They weren't sitting behind a table like gods on a mountain anymore. They were standing on the floor, looking like ordinary people who had just met a hero. The stern man, the one who had chuckled, stepped forward first. He didn't offer his hand to shake. Instead, he got down on one knee, so he was shorter than the boy. He looked the boy directly in the eyes, and there were tears shining in the corners of his own eyes. "I want to apologize," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion. "I laughed at you. I underestimated you. And I've never been so happy to be wrong in my entire life." The boy looked at him, surprised. He hadn't expected an apology. He just gave a small, shy nod. "It is okay," the boy said softly. "I am used to it." This simple answer broke the judge's heart even more. The woman with the glasses stepped forward next. She didn't kneel, but she placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "You didn't just play the piano," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You spoke to us. You told us a story without words. Tonight, you weren't a contestant. You were a teacher." She told him that in all her years of teaching, she had never seen someone connect with the music so deeply. She told him that he had a gift that couldn't be taught in schools, a gift that came from somewhere else. The boy didn't really know how to react to the praise. He wasn't used to adults treating him with this kind of reverence. He just stood there, holding his hands behind his back, listening politely. To him, what he did wasn't magic. It was just what happened when he sat down at a piano. It was as natural as breathing. The conversation wasn't just about praise, though. The judges wanted to know about his training, his life, and his background. They were fascinated by him. They learned that back home, he practiced for hours every day, not because his parents forced him to, but because he loved it. They learned that he didn't care much for fame or winning trophies. He just loved the feeling of the keys under his fingers. He told them that when he played, he didn't see notes on a page. He saw colors and shapes. He felt emotions. When the music was sad, he cried. When it was happy, he felt like flying. Hearing this, the judges realized that this was the secret. This was why he was so good. He wasn't thinking about technique or trying to impress a panel of critics. He was just being honest. He was letting his true self shine through the music, with no filter and no fear. It was a profound lesson for everyone in the room. They had spent their lives analyzing music, dissecting it, and judging it. But this boy just felt it. When the meeting was over, the boy walked back out to the main hall. The final results of the competition were about to be announced. The audience quieted down as the host walked to the microphone. Everyone knew who had won. It was the only thing anyone could talk about. But when the host opened the envelope and read the name, it still felt special. "It's the winner of this year's competition," the host shouted, "is the young pianist from Japan." The applause that erupted was 10 times louder than before. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a deafening roar. The lights hit the stage and the boy walked out. He hadn't changed his clothes. He wasn't wearing a winner's sash or holding a trophy yet. He was just the same small boy in the black suit. But to the audience, he looked different. He looked taller. He looked like a king. As he walked toward the center of the stage to accept his award, he looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the judges standing and clapping. He saw the man who had laughed, wiping a tear from his cheek. He saw the woman with the glasses beaming with pride. He saw the young man in the back row who had shouted bravo. For the first time that night, the boy allowed himself to really smile. It was a big, genuine smile that lit up his whole face. He accepted the heavy trophy, holding it with both hands. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't thank his agents or his lawyers. He just walked to the edge of the stage and bowed deeply to the audience. Then, he did something unexpected. He walked over to the piano one last time. The crowd went silent, wondering what he was going to do. He sat down. He didn't play a long, complicated song. Instead, he played a simple melody. It was sweet, soft, and pure. It was a thank you note to the room. It was his way of saying goodbye. As the final notes drifted into the air, the message was clear to everyone listening. Talent is not about where you come from. It is not about how old you are or how you look. It is about what is inside your heart. The boy had walked into the room a stranger, underestimated and laughed at. He left as a legend. He had taught the American judges a lesson they would never forget. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes the smallest packages hold the most magnificent gifts. And as he stood up to take his final bow, the concert hall wasn't just full of people. It was full of believers.